This paper is a kind of reflection on topics that I have already discussed on other occasions at conferences and publication, and some lines of research that I've been carrying out in recent years, which in my opinion are very stimulating and fruitful in proposing keys to interpreting the Byzantine and giudicati history of Sardinia. These elements I present, in my personal opinion, show, together with others, the presence of historical and cultural memory in the societies of the giudicati that at different times allow the history of these small polities, states, as you prefer, to be rewritten according to the needs of the moment, of course. Historical memory based on sources that we no longer possess, but whose reflections we can discern in the narrative and hagiographic sources we know. Elements that show the connection, between the late Byzantine or early giudicati Sardinian society and the giudicati societies. For reason of time, I will only present a few topics as examples. Between the second half of the 10th century and the first half of the 11th century, Sardinia interrupted the contacts, even indirect, with the Byzantine world. The oldest sources point to a unitary island government headed by a ruler called Archon Sardinias or Iudex Sardinia in Byzantine and Papal sources. Instead, from the mid-11th century, documents inside and outside the island attest to the existence of at least two iudices, two judges. One ruling in Rennu, a kingdom called Ore, later Logudoro or Torres, and the other in the Locus de Caralis, in the kingdom, in the giudicato of Caralis. From 1073 onwards, an epistle of Pope Gregory VII also attests to other giudicati, and has many iudices of Arborea and Gallura. As perhaps a watershed role in this profound institutional change in the island was played by Mujahid ibn Abd al-Alamiri, Lord of Denia and the Balearic Islands, who, between 1015 and 1016, carried out the longest-lasting Muslim occupation of part of the island territory. A first element of reflection. Returning to the judge of Caralis, quoted above, he was Orzocco Torquitorio I, 1058-1089. The dates are important. Probably the son of Mariano Saluzio I, who was active before 1058. In one of his documents, the judge claimed his royal dignitas, status, with the formula Rex adeo electus vel coronatus, king chosen or crowned and crowned by God himself. This formula is the Latin translation of the name of the Byzantine ceremony relating to the basileis called Theosteptos in Greek, the king crowned by God himself first. That means that someone in the court or in the chancery of the locus de Caralis, the giudicato of Caralis, was aware of this particular imperial ceremony and used it in this document as an extra element to emphasize the nature of the judge's power. There is more. About 60 years later, Judge Constantine I of Torres, the other giudicato in the northwestern part of the island, used in one of his documents dated to shortly before 1120, also used the same formula, Rex adeo electus vel coronatus. In essence, the two documents state that the two judges have in their giudicati the place that the basileus have in the empire. If I wasn't afraid to say a juridical blasphemy, the formula used in those documents seems to anticipate by 2 centuries the political, legal formula Rex in regno suo est imperator. The king is the emperor in his kingdom. That expressed the fullness of powers, plenitudo potestatis, of each king within his kingdom, which theoretically was justified, or legally justified, in the 13th century in the Western world, in Western European. As far as the Giudicato of Caralis is concerned, this formula, in addition to the continued use of seals bearing alphabet, the alternating dynastic names of Torquator and Saluzio. Some documents written in Greek alphabet, although in Sardinian language, once again could confirm the breadth of the links between the imperial world and Sardinia, especially in the sphere of political power. There is another example concerning Arborea, this time, in the first half of the 12th century, that is equally interesting. Card 132 of the Condaghe of Santa Maria di Bonarcado informs us that in the years 1147, 7 siblings who were servants of the above-mentioned monastery refused to continue to serve it, stating that they were free persons. After they had been sued before the Corona de Judice, the court, the tribunal of the judge, the supreme tribunal of the giudicato, they brought a letter sealed with a bullatorio, the bullotirion in Greek, of Judge Comita. The document was thought a forgery by the judge himself, and as a consequence of this crime, he decided that the buiaria, the seal keeper, please a minute, or better, the keeper of the bullatorio, the bullotirion, will be executed immediately, and that the 7 siblings were tortured and hanged. The Sardinian verb that indicates the torture is iscodoglare, correct? Iscodoglare. It has been linked by philologists to the terms ocru, ogu, eye, and it has been translated in different ways, to blind, to dazzle, but perhaps also to dislocate bones and articulations. The mention in the source of ferros cagentes, incandescent irons, would suggest Byzantine torture aimed at blinding, I quote, by gouging out the eyes, sometimes using a hot poker. This form of torture was usually reserved for those who usurped and undermined imperial powers. Now, I will dwell only on a few elements that may provide further food for thought on that delicate phase of transition between the 10th and the 12th centuries, which I will observe through narrative and hagiographic sources that prove to be rich in insights. Let's start in chronological order from the Giudicato of Torres. The Chronicle of Leo of Ostia recalls that shortly after January 1063, envoys from Barisone, king of Sardinia, came to this monastery, Monte Cassino. The chronicler attributed a royal title or status to Barisone, perhaps based on a document carried by his envoys bearing a seal similar to that of the diploma from 1065, reading Barisone Rex, with which the ruler donated some churches to the abbey. Or perhaps the copyist ignored the Sardinian institutional structure, since in the document issued by the Giudicato Chancery in 1065, Barisone I stated that he ruled over the kingdom called Ore, in Renno quodicitur Ore, in the northwestern part of the island. The judge attested by these two sources, Barisone I is said to be the first ruler of this Giudicato, who shared the throne with his nephew, the future judge Mariano I, 1065 to 1114. From these first two judges, the dynasty continued until around the mid-13th century, when it became extinct with the death of the last Iudicissa, Adelasia, wife first of Ubaldo II Visconti, judge of Gallura, and in second marriage of Enzo or Heinz, the son of the Emperor Frederick II of Suabia. Quite different is the account of some narrative and hagiographic sources, which link the beginning of this dynasty to a miraculous episode, within which some women of the aforementioned dynasty played a very active roles, taking on the political management of the kingdom, Renno. These sources present a very different historical picture and date back to periods distant from the events described, in which the Giudicato of Torres was in deep crisis due to the growing pressure of the Commune of Genoa, Pisa, and the Apostolic See, which increasingly claimed its dominion eminence on the island. Not to mention the interference of the Holy Roman Empire around the mid-13th century. Two of these sources share a narrative on the origin of the Turris dynasty, which is based on miracle, whose protagonists are Saint Gavinus and an alleged judge called Comita. Let's begin our examination of the sources in chronological order again. The liturgical officium of Saint Gavinus is composed of the Passio of the Turris martyrs, Gavinus, Protus, and Januarius, during Diocletian's persecution in 303, divided into 8 lectiones and dated between the mid-11th and the very early 12th century. From the first quarter of the 13th century, the 9 lectio, 9 lesson, was added. This is called Inventio of the relics of the 3 martyrs and contains references to the dynasty of the judges of Torres. The source presents a quick description of the high moral profile of Iudex Comita, who drew on the miroir of princes and had him by God's will to rule over 2 giudicati, Logudoro and Arborea. The text says, by divine will, it happened that Comita, a most holy man, was elected judge to rule over the 2 giudicati of Orim and Arborea. Let's pay attention to the term Orim used by the scribe to refer to the giudicato of Logudoro. It is very similar to the term Ore used in the document of Turris Chancery of 1065. It could be a useful element to date when Inventio was written, since it is a term that has disappeared in the Turris sources immediately following. Despite the absolutely positive description of Judge Comita in the source, the ruler contracted a very serious illness. The diagnosis was terrible. The doctor believed, I'm quoting, doctors believed it was incurable leprosy. The desperate judge turned to God until Saint Gavinus appeared to him in a dream and told him that the Lord, moved by his pain, his mother's prayer, and the martyr's intercession, of course, had decided to save him, provided he built a church to house the mortal remains of the 3 martyrs. Another interesting and useful fact is that in Inventio, the main role in the treatment of the relics was played by the women of the family, and also by the bishop of Torres. And another fact that could indicate when the original text was written, that is before 1073, when the Turris prelate was elevated to the rank of metropolitan archbishop by Gregory VII. Inventio. Inventio has many elements in common with another narrative source written in Logudoro, the Condaghe of San Gavino. The proposed date for the writing of this narrative, second narrative, is range from the 12th to the 16th century, according to some scholars. Equally conflicting are the assessments of its historical reliability. We have an edition of 1620, edited by the Turris canon Francisco Roca, in a period of full confrontation with the Archdiocese of Cagliari for the primacy on the island, which generated a frantic search for holy bodies, cuerpos santos. On some themes, the narrative coincides with that of Inventio, while on others, the differences are considerable, and this is due to their different purposes. According to Condaghe, Comita was the first judge of Logudoro, and the one who had the Basilica of San Gavinus built on the relics of the 3 Turris martyrs in the area of Turris Libisonis. Condaghe begins with a strong emphasis on the role of Roman Church, especially in the political sphere of the Giudicato. It affirms that after some time, does not say, however, with respect to when, Sardinia was populated by Christians, almost as if the island had fallen into hands of infidels, and that thanks to this, the local lords, the iudices, have the island of Sardinia returned to the dependence of the Apostolic See. First suggestion, while remaining in the spirit of this pro-Apostolic See narrative, could the reference to the infidels be inspired by the brief presence of Mujahid on the island? I imagine this because the events attributed by the sources to the judge of Torres could only happen before Barisone I, that is, a few decades after the conquest by the Lord of Denia. Let's continue. Condaga narrates that according to the will of the Curia of Rome, the freemen, the elders of the giudicato of the Logudoro, elected as their judge a good man called Comide. The moral characteristics of the ruler were such that the elders of the two giudicati, Logudoro and Arborea, wanted him as their iudex for life. On the government of Comita over the two giudicati, the two sources agrees. Then, the source, Inventio, the Condaghe, focuses on its main theme, an unspecified illness of Judge Comita and the related intervention of St. Gavinus, who, in a dream, urged him to go to Mount Agello, in Turris Libisonis, to build a church dedicated to him and his companions in martyrdom, Protus and Januarius, buried in Balai, a few kilometers away. When he arrived in Turris Libisonis, Comita dreamed of a man wearing a white robe like a knight on horseback over the water of the sea, who showed him where he should build the church. After he went to the place indicated, the Judice gave 3 strokes of the hoe and had a bed prepared for him to spend the night there. The next day he awoke safely from leprosy. This is the first explicit mention of the judge's illness. I will not dwell on many other data from these interesting sources to which I devoted a recent paper, but I will explain why I'm quoting it here. The descriptions of Judge Comita in Condaghe do not show valid reason to justify a onset of this very severe leprosy, which would indicate God's strong disappointment, displeasure with the judge. He was well liked by his subject, particularly charitable to the poor, to defenseless, orphans. So why? Why this illness? What was Comita's sin? Because there had to be at least one. Perhaps there was an incestuous relationship between Comita and their sister Caterina, who, at a certain point in the narrative of Condaghe, complete the miracle by having the burials of the 3 martyrs found. She must also have been alone. She thus cooperates with her brother to signify that if God had involved her in this operation, she must also have been involved earlier in the sin with Comita. Both were pardoned, and Caterina was able to act as Iudicissa mother towards the Donigeddu or Godori or Torcotorio, the son of Comita and, of course, also by Caterina, whom she had elected to the Giudicato throne by the elders of Logudoro and Arborea. A similar hypothesis was only hinted at by Giuseppe Meloni in his edition of Condaghe, but was later abandoned for heretical crimes of which there is no trace in the sources. Why did I examine this episode of the miracle granted to Comita? Because Condaghe narrative seems to have the purpose of exalting the dynasty of judges of Torres rather than the Apostolic See, as has been said so far. And it does so through a sort of legend of foundation, or better, of re-foundation of the entire family. A narrative according to which, thanks to the miracle received by the alleged progenitor, Comita, the entire family receiving divine favor was healed of the sin. A dynasty that, in the first half of the 13th century, experienced the increased political pressure of the 2 republics of Genoa and Pisa, and, moreover, of the powerful families of Ligurian and Tuscan origin present in Sardinia, with continuous effects in the political life of the Giudicato. To narrate these events, the author of this narrative drew inspiration from the generation of Judge Comita I, 1198, 1218, and that of his son Mariano II and his grandson, which lasted until the mid-13th century, when the dynasty itself disappeared. It is a coincidence that in the first decades of the 13th century, Benedetta, Iudicissa of Caralis, sister-in-law of Mariano II of Torres, in a moment of serious difficulty for the Giudicato and her house, again because of the brothers, the Pisan brothers Umberto I and Lamberto Visconti, made a political use of a miracle obtained by Bishop George in favor of a character called Torquitorius Calaritanensis princeps, the prince of Caralis, Torquitorius. The alleged progenitor of that house, beyond this similarity between the two dynastic progenitors, who are said to have benefited from as many miracles, there are some significant differences in the two stories. The first difference is that the protagonist of the narrative of foundation or refoundation is not a martyr, as Gavinus, Protos, and Januarius. Although Caralis could boast more than one martyr. Think of Saint Saturninus, who is mentioned in the chancery documents of the local judges as the patron of the dynasty. Sanctum Sadurrum Nostro, our Saint Saturninus. Or think also of Saint Ephesius, whom we will discuss later in other respect. Torquitorius and his alleged wife Nispella have been identified with an homonymous ruler and his wife, who are mentioned in a Greek epigraph that is currently kept in the parish church of Sant'Antioco. The inscription recalls two male characters, Torquatorius, qualified as Protospatarios, but not Archon, a second male character named Salusius, who endowed with the title of Archon. Perhaps they were father and sons, who rule associated over the giudicato of Caralis. And finally, a female character, Nispella, who has been interpreted as the probable wife of Torquitorius through a problematic integration of part of the missing epigraphic text. Archaeologists and art historians have dated this epigraph to the period between the end of the 10th century and the first half of the 11th. Torquitorius and Nispella should have lived in that chronological span that is very close to that in which the events relating to Judge Comita of Torres and Saint Gavinus should have took place. The second difference between the two narratives is that the protagonist of Officium of St. George, which contains the episode of the miracle granted to Torquitorius, is a bishop, still alive, who would that interact with the prince, and obtain the healing of the above-mentioned Torquatorius from a sort of divine punishment. He could no longer feed himself because the food he touched turned into insects and snakes. So, if Princeps Torquitorius was really the first iudex of Caralis, who had to rule at the same time or immediately after Mujahid's incursion into the island, he and his dynasty might have had an interest in the dissemination of the miracle as a tangible sign of forgiveness and divine benevolence for the Princeps and his dynasty, since it would probably have to compete with new centers of power that were forming, at least the giudicati of Arborea and Torres, as we said. Again, the miracle cleansed the dynasty of sins committed and was the visible manifestation of the God's forgiveness. This episode of the miracle of St. George was reused in the first decade of the 13th century by Iudicissa Benedetta of Caralis, 1214, 1233. Both periods in which Torquitorius and Benedetta acted were characterized by great political upheavals. For the first decades of the 11th century, the probable disappearance of the archontate and the origin of the giudicati. For the first decades of the 13th century, the dynasty of the Judge of Caralis was in serious difficulty for the death in 1214 of Judge Guglielmo Salusio, Marquis of Massa, perhaps the main protagonist of the last 30 years of Sardinian history, who had rejected the attempts to expansion on the island by the Republic of Genoa and the Kingdom of Aragon. St. George has been called by Corrado Zedda there a figure with a highly dubious biography, since he is called bishop at a time when there were still no suffragan in the archdiocese of Caralis. Therefore, the reference to the Princeps Torquitorius and his wife, alleged wife Nispella, would have been used to give reliability and truthfulness to the narrative and anchor Bishop George to history. But the legend does not mention only the couple Torquitorius and Nispella, but also other illustrious characters, perhaps members of the Giudicato dynasty. One of them was called nobilissimus, most noble, a term that seems the literal translation of the Greek title Eugenestatos, which is present in the epigraph of Santa Sofia of Villasor, which is dated to the end of the 10th century. Furthermore, another interesting element of Vita is the use of this miracle that was made in the first decades of the 13th century, when Eudice's authority was jeopardized by very important internal and external political and social factors. Then narratives with quite clear political aims have been elaborated to endow and at least the 2 of the 4 island dynasties of judges with prestigious origins, Carlis and Torres, who thanks to as many miracles could justify their authority over parts of the island and also their status as rulers. Other elements that should not be forgotten in the context of the discourse we are making on the historical and cultural memory of Sardinian judges is the case, in this case of Carlis, are the use of the Greek historical, the Greek type seals with alternating dynastic name by the Marquis Guglielmo and his daughter Benedetta, as well as the description of the steps of her election to the giudicato throne, more solito, as usual, made by the same Judicissa Benedetta in 1217 to Pope Honorius III, steps that were virtually identical to those for the election of the ancient praeses or Iudex Provinciae of the 6th century, even if more than half a millennium separates them. I have some time more or not? Because I don't know. 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Oh, okay. I've talked also of Saint Ephesius, and now some attention to the Passion of Saint Ephesius. That is a very interesting sources for some Byzantine elements used also in several different times. The Passion of Saint Ephesius is an interesting case of study for the stimuli it offers on the topics of relation between Muslim and Byzantine Sardinia. On this geographic source, we have a manuscript tradition that raises numerous questions not yet fully resolved by scholars. The oldest codex of the Passio, Sancti Ephesi Martyris, is a 12th century manuscript. The Vaticanus Latinus 6,453, probably written in Pisa, perhaps an important fact if we consider the bond that tied the city, Ephesius, and the other Sardinian martyrs in the 11th century. The first part of this Passio, which is based on St. Procopius' second legend, Ante 787, takes place in the east, in Campania, southern Italy. In the latter location, it sets a great battle against some hostes Romani imperi, called also Saracens in the text, that invaded some imperial provinces, seizing people and things found there. The manuscript speaks also of a second clash that, however, took place in Sardinia afterwards against the generic, cruel, and impious gens barbarians, who controlled Sardinia shortly afterwards. So the author of this codex makes a clear distinction between the enemies of this future martyr. In Sardinia, they are barbarians, that is, non-Romanized people. The purpose of this essay, some of the most important data of these sources are certain terms we found in its various manuscripts. The first is Arborea. You talk about Arborea in the previous paper. And the second term is Tirus, always in the region of actual Arborea. There is another version, the Codex Caralitanus, a 6th century manuscript, but based on an earlier codex that contains a narration of the alleged Ephesius expedition to the island with even more nationalist Sardinian identity-making connotation. In it, the enemies against which he fought in Campania were some generic imperi hostes, while as regards Sardinia, the source states that Ephesius' enemies were Ilienses et Iolenses, populi montani Sardinia insulum, two peoples of the ancient civitates barbaria. This part of the codex seems to be the interpolation of an earlier manuscript made by the 16th, 17th century anonymous geographer, aimed at identifying the enemies of the empire with the two mentioned peoples among the fiercest opponents of Roman rule, already in the Augustan age. This learned identitarian nationalist interpretation appears to be very present in Sardinian historiography of those centuries, as demonstrated by the works of Juan Francisco Fara and Juan Arc. So far, scholars peacefully accepted that Ephesus military action in Sardinia were set in the territory called Arborea. And the author of the, no, I have to cut because notes, I can't explain, I can't read all this. Okay, in the light of previous elements, we can consider two hypotheses. The Arborea chapter narrates some events in Sardinia, some events that we cannot precisely date, important events that may have pushed the Basileus to send one of his duces, or rather a magister militum. In the manuscript is called, Ephesus is called Stratilates, to Sardinia to curb Barbaricini's attacks and recover the territories that had fallen under their control. Some scholars claim that the hagiographer of Ephesus echoed some text documents on Zabarda's military campaign and adapted them to the reality of the 10th, 11th century, which could be the time of the hagiographer. We believe that some data could confirm the events narrated in the Passio and could refer to the story of Zabardas at the end of the 6th century. In 1736, Giovanni Battista Madeddu, in one of his Gozos, dedicated to Ephesus and based on the Codex Vaticanus Latinus, after mentioning Ephesus' conversion in Campania, just before his military campaign in Sardinia, inserted a reference to two other saints, Entius and Edictius, converted to the new faith by Ephesus, along with many others. In 1815, the historian Goffredo Casales collected a popular tradition about a church located near the village of Sorradile that is located a little to the north of Forum Traiani, the likely seat of the Byzantine dukes at the time of the war against the Barbaricini, that was dedicated to these two saints, companions of Ephesus. They are said to have taken part in the above-mentioned military campaign, which was described, however, according to the version of the Codex Caralitanus. And recalling the inventio, he also added in, together with the inscription in Caralis, that recalled Sanctus Edictius Martyr qui vixit annis viginti nove. The possible military entry of Zabardas could be the origin of this popular tradition, also because the region of these two saints, of the tradition above these two saints, are exactly connected to the region of Forum Traiani. There is conclusion, if no, it's too large. As I said at the beginning, the reinterpretation of noun sources of different nature is a very stimulating and offered angles of observation of events and personalities already known and new, in some cases, that greatly enrich the picture we have of Byzantine and Giudicati Sardinia. Many other narrative and documentary sources have not been examined here for reason of space and time, but are nevertheless the focus of my present and future research. Thank you for your attention.